Qin Shi Huang. Qin Shi Huang became China's first emperor in 221 BCE after unifying warring states through brutal military campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands. His obsession with immortality led him to consume mercury daily, believing it would grant eternal life, though it ultimately poisoned him to death in 210 BCE. He buried alive an estimated 460 scholars who disagreed with his policies during the infamous burning of books and burying of scholars between 213 and 210 BCE. The construction of his massive tomb complex, guarded by over 8,000 terracotta warriors, required roughly 700,000 laborers working for 38 years, with many dying from exhaustion and harsh conditions. Workers and concubines were sealed alive inside the tomb upon completion to protect its secrets. His expansion of the Great Wall killed an estimated 400,000 workers who perished from exposure, starvation, and brutal working conditions in remote mountain terrain. While he standardized China's writing system, currency, and measurements, these reforms came through ruthless enforcement and mass executions. His dynasty collapsed just 4 years after his death, as the population revolted against the tyranny that had defined his reign, proving that his empire was built entirely on fear rather than loyalty. Attila the Hun. Attila ruled the Hunnic Empire from 434 to 453 CE, earning the title Scourge of God, as his armies devastated Europe from the Ural Mountains to the Rhine River. His military campaigns relied on psychological warfare, including sending severed heads to enemy leaders and burning entire cities to the ground as warnings. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 CE resulted in tens of thousands of deaths on both sides, as Roman and Visigoth forces barely stopped his advance into Gaul. Historians estimate that his campaigns across Europe caused over 500,000 deaths through direct combat, massacres of civilians, and destruction of agricultural lands that led to widespread starvation. His soldiers endured brutal conditions during these conquests, facing harsh terrain, limited supplies, and diseases that swept through military camps. Attila demanded absolute loyalty from his warriors and reportedly executed subordinates he deemed weak or cowardly, maintaining control through fear as much as charisma. He died suddenly in 453 CE on his wedding night, officially from a severe nosebleed, though some historians believe he was assassinated. Without his leadership, the Hunnic Empire immediately fractured and dissolved, as his sons fought over succession and subject peoples rebelled, revealing that the empire existed solely through his personal force of will. Vlad the Impaler. Vlad III ruled Wallachia intermittently between 1448 and 1476, earning his notorious epithet through his preferred execution method of impaling victims on sharpened wooden stakes and leaving them to die slowly over hours or days. He created forests of the impaled, displaying thousands of bodies along roadsides as psychological warfare against the invading Ottoman Empire and as warnings to his own subjects. Historical records suggest he killed between 40,000 and 100,000 people during his relatively short reign, though exact numbers remain disputed among scholars. In one particularly brutal incident, he invited approximately 500 boyars, or noble families, to an Easter feast and then impaled all of them for allegedly conspiring against his father. His soldiers fought numerous battles against Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II's vastly larger armies, with many dying in desperate defensive campaigns to maintain Wallachia's independence. Contemporary German pamphlets, which were essentially anti-Vlad propaganda, described him nailing turbans to Ottoman ambassadors' heads and impaling them for refusing to remove their headwear in his presence. Despite his cruelty, Romanian tradition remembers him as a national hero who defended Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion, demonstrating how historical legacy depends heavily on perspective. His brutal reputation inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula character centuries later, forever linking his name with vampire mythology and making him history's most famous practitioner of impalement, Ivan the Terrible. Ivan IV became Russia's first Tsar in 1547 and earned his epithet through decades of paranoid brutality that terrorized his own people as much as foreign enemies. In 1565, he created the Oprichnina, a 6,000-man secret police force dressed in black robes who rode black horses and carried dog heads as symbols, confiscating land and executing anyone suspected of treason. The most infamous atrocity occurred in 1570, when Ivan suspected the city of Novgorod of plotting against him and ordered a massacre that lasted 5 weeks, with estimates ranging from 3,000 to 60,000 civilians killed, many thrown through holes in the frozen Volkhov River. His paranoid rages became legendary, culminating in 1581 when he struck his own son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with his pointed staff during an argument, inflicting wounds that killed the young prince days later. Russian soldiers died in his prolonged and often unsuccessful wars against the Tatars, Lithuanians, and Swedes as he attempted to expand Russia's borders and gain access to the Baltic Sea. Contemporary accounts from German merchants and Russian chronicles describe mass executions, torture, and the systematic destruction of entire families suspected of disloyalty. Despite his cruelty, Ivan significantly expanded Russian territory and centralized power, though his later years were marked by remorse and extreme religious devotion. He died in 1584 while playing chess, possibly from poisoning, leaving Russia in chaos that led directly to the devastating Time of Troubles. Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold II ruled Belgium from 1865 to 1909, but is most infamous for his personal ownership of the Congo Free State from 1885 to 1908, where he orchestrated one of history's worst colonial atrocities. Unlike other African territories that were official colonies, the Congo was Leopold's private property, run as a massive rubber extraction business that treated the Congolese population as slave labor. His private army, the Force Publique, enforced brutal rubber quotas by cutting off the hands of those who failed to meet their targets, with soldiers required to present severed hands as proof they hadn't wasted bullets. Historians estimate that between 10 and 15 million Congolese people died during his rule, roughly half the territory's population, through murder, starvation, exhaustion, and disease caused by forced labor conditions. Children were held hostage in fenced compounds to force their parents to work, and entire villages were burned if quotas weren't met. While presenting himself to European audiences as a humanitarian bringing civilization to Africa, Leopold personally profited enormously from Congolese suffering, using the wealth to build monuments in Belgium. International pressure, led by British activist E.D., morale and missionary photographs by Alice Seeley Harris documenting the atrocities, finally forced Leopold to cede the Congo to Belgium in 1908. His crimes inspired Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and Belgium didn't officially apologize for the colonial atrocities until 2020. Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler led Nazi Germany from 1934 to 1945 and orchestrated the deadliest conflict in human history, resulting in approximately 70 to 85 million deaths worldwide during World War II. His systematic genocide, known as the Holocaust, murdered 6 million Jews along with 5 million others, including Romani people, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and Soviet POWs, in an industrialized network of concentration camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Dachau. Hitler sent millions of German soldiers to their deaths in catastrophic military campaigns, most notably Operation Barbarossa, which launched 3.8 million Axis troops into the Soviet Union in 1941, and the Battle of Stalingrad, where approximately 2 million total casualties occurred in a single battle. His total war strategy deliberately targeted civilians, with entire cities like Dresden, Coventry, and Warsaw bombed or razed to the ground. The cult of personality surrounding Hitler was so powerful that German soldiers continued fighting for the Führer, even when defeat was mathematically certain in 1945. In March 1945, he issued the Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of German infrastructure, factories, and resources to prevent them from falling into Allied hands, showing he preferred Germany's total destruction to surrender. Extensively documented through Nuremberg trial records, survivor testimonies, Nazi administrative documents, and thousands of photographs and films, Hitler's crimes redefined evil in the modern era. He committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. 1945, as Soviet forces closed in, leaving behind a continent in ruins and a legacy that led to the United Nations, Geneva Conventions, and the principle of never again. Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union from 1924 until his death in 1953, implementing policies that historians estimate killed between 20 and 25 million Soviet citizens through executions, forced labor, and deliberate famine. The Great Purge from 1936 to 1938 saw between 750,000 and 1.5 million people executed as Stalin eliminated perceived threats within the Communist Party, military leadership, and general population, while millions more were sent to the Gulag forced labor camp system. His forced collectivization of agriculture caused the Holodomor, a deliberate famine in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933 that killed an estimated 3.5 to 5 million people as grain was seized and exported while peasants starved. The Gulag system held over 18 million people throughout its existence, with approximately 1.5 million dying from harsh conditions, malnutrition, and brutal treatment in camps across Siberia and Kazakhstan. During World War II, Stalin's Order No. 227 in 1942 declared that retreat equaled treason, with soldiers shot by their own officers for falling back, and penal battalions were sent ahead to clear minefields with their bodies. He purged military officers before the war, executing thousands of experienced commanders and weakening the Red Army just as Nazi Germany prepared to invade. Entire ethnic groups, including Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and others, were forcibly relocated to Kazakhstan and Siberia in cattle cars, with hundreds of thousands dying during transport and resettlement. Stalin died from a stroke in March 1953, possibly left untreated for hours because his purges had created such fear that guards were terrified to check on him, and many doctors had been arrested or executed in recent purges. Mao Zedong led the People's Republic of China from 1949 until his death in 1976, and is responsible for more deaths than any other leader in human history, with estimates ranging from 40 to 80 million people killed through his policies. The Great Leap, forward from 1958 to 1962, attempted to rapidly industrialize China through forced collectivization and backyard steel furnaces, but instead caused the largest famine in recorded history, killing between 15 and 55 million people. Peasants were forced to melt down farming tools to meet unrealistic steel production quotas, producing useless metal while crops rotted in fields, and the government continued exporting grain even as millions starved. Mao's campaign to exterminate sparrows, which he considered pests, eliminated a natural predator of locusts, leading to massive locust swarms that devastated crops and worsened the famine. The Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 killed between 500,000 and 2 million people as student militias called Red Guards attacked enemies of the revolution, including intellectuals, teachers, and anyone with suspected bourgeois tendencies. Mao's personality cult reached extreme levels, with the Little Red Book of his quotations becoming mandatory reading, and citizens competed to demonstrate revolutionary fervor through public denunciations and violence. Some provinces lost up to one-third of their population during the Great Leap Forward, yet Mao continued the policies even when presented with evidence of widespread starvation. Despite the massive death toll, Mao's portrait still hangs in Tiananmen Square, and the Chinese government officially describes his legacy as 70% positive and 30% negative. Pol Pot. Pol Pot led the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia from 1975 to 1979 and killed approximately 1.5 to 2 million people, roughly 25% of Cambodia's population, in just 4 years. His attempt to create an agrarian communist utopia led to the forced evacuation of all cities, with millions of urban residents marched into the countryside at gunpoint to work in collective farms, and thousands died during these forced relocations. The Khmer Rouge systematically targeted intellectuals, professionals, and anyone with education, with simply wearing glasses often marking someone for execution, as glasses suggested literacy and bourgeois background. Prisoners at Tuol Sleng Prison, also known as S-21, were meticulously photographed and tortured before execution, with records showing that only 7 of approximately 20,000 prisoners survived. The regime used agricultural tools like hoes and axes to execute victims in order to save bullets, and mass graves known as the killing fields contained hundreds of thousands of bodies. Children were indoctrinated and turned into soldiers and executioners, forced to prove their loyalty by killing prisoners, including sometimes their own family members. Starvation, disease, exhaustion, and execution killed people at an astonishing rate as the Khmer Rouge forced the entire population to work in rice paddies under brutal conditions with minimal food. The Vietnamese army invaded in 1979 and overthrew Pol Pot, who escaped to the jungle and lived under house arrest until his death in 1998. never facing international trial, despite being one of history's worst mass murderers. Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein ruled Iraq as dictator from 1979 until 2003, launching devastating wars and internal campaigns that killed an estimated 250,000 to 290,000 people. The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 resulted in between 500,000 and 1 million total deaths, as Saddam sent waves of young Iraqi conscripts into brutal trench warfare reminiscent of World War I. During the Anfal campaign against Kurdish populations between 1986 and 1989, Iraqi forces systematically destroyed thousands of villages and used chemical weapons in what international courts later ruled was genocide. The most notorious chemical attack occurred in Halabja in March 1988, where poison gas killed approximately 5,000 Kurdish civilians in a single day, with survivors suffering lifelong health effects. Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 led to the Gulf War and subsequent international sanctions that devastated Iraq's civilian population, while his regime maintained lavish palaces. His secret police force, the Mukhabarat, operated a network of torture facilities where thousands of political dissidents, suspected opponents, and ordinary citizens accused of disloyalty were brutally interrogated and executed. He ordered the draining of the Mesopotamian marshes to punish the marsh Arabs who had supported uprisings, destroying an ecosystem that had existed for 5,000 years and displacing hundreds of thousands. His sons, Uday and Qusay, ran personal torture chambers and were notorious for their sadistic cruelty. Saddam was captured by U.S. forces in December 2003, tried by an Iraqi court, and executed by hanging in December 2006 after being found guilty of crimes against humanity. Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung founded North Korea in 1948 and established a hereditary dictatorship that continues under his grandson Kim Jong-un, making it the only communist dynasty in history. He initiated the Korean War in 1950 by invading South Korea, resulting in approximately 2.5 million deaths over 3 years of brutal conflict that devastated the entire peninsula. Kim created one of the most totalitarian states ever known, implementing a 3-generation punishment system where entire families could be imprisoned in labor camps for one member's alleged crime against the state. The personality cult surrounding Kim reached extreme levels, with mandatory worship sessions, giant statues throughout the country, and citizens required to wear badges bearing his image at all times. North Korea's prison camp system, known as Kwanliso, currently holds an estimated 200,000 people in conditions involving systematic torture, starvation, and execution, with entire families imprisoned together. The famine of the 1990s, caused partly by economic mismanagement and the regime's prioritization of military spending, killed between 600,000 and 3 million North Koreans, while the leadership lived in luxury. Defectors report eating grass, tree bark, and in desperate cases resorting to cannibalism during the famine years, while public executions punish those caught stealing food. Camp 22, one of the largest prison facilities, reportedly held over 50,000 prisoners and conducted chemical weapons experiments on inmates according to survivor testimonies. The regime maintains power through complete information control, making North Korea one of the most isolated populations on Earth, with citizens unable to access outside information or leave the country. Idi Amin. Idi Amin seized power in Uganda through a military coup in 1971 and ruled until 1979, killing an estimated 100,000 to 500,000 people during his 8-year reign of terror. His secret police force, the State Research Bureau, operated torture chambers where thousands of Ugandans were interrogated, mutilated, and executed on the slightest suspicion of opposing his regime. In 1972, Amin expelled approximately 60,000 Asians, mostly Indians and Pakistanis, who formed the backbone of Uganda's economy, giving them just 90 days to leave and confiscating their businesses and property, which collapsed the economy. His security forces conducted systematic massacres in the Acholi and Lango regions, targeting ethnic groups he perceived as threats, with so many bodies dumped into the Nile River that dams downstream had to be cleared regularly. Amin's erratic behavior became legendary internationally, including declaring himself King of Scotland, sending bizarre telegrams to world leaders, and adopting the full title His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji, Dr. Idi Amin Dada. Reports from survivors and investigators suggest he kept severed heads of executed enemies in his freezer and allegedly fed bodies to crocodiles, though some of these claims remain difficult to verify. His public safety unit and various security agencies operated independently, creating a climate of terror where anyone could be arrested, tortured, and killed without warning or trial. Amin was finally overthrown in 1979 when Tanzanian forces, allied with Ugandan rebels, invaded and drove him from power, after which he lived in comfortable exile in Saudi Arabia until his death in 2003. Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya from 1969 until 2011, maintaining power through a combination of revolutionary guards who crushed dissent and a bizarre personality cult centered around his Green Book ideology. His regime regularly broadcast public hangings on state television to terrorize the population, with dissidents executed in sports stadiums and town squares as warnings against opposition. The Abu Salim prison massacre in June 1996 saw security forces kill an estimated 1,270 prisoners in a single day after inmates protested living conditions, with bodies reportedly bulldozed into mass graves. Gaddafi supported international terrorism throughout the 1980s, including the Lockerbie bombing in 1988 that killed 270 people and the 1986 Berlin disco bombing that killed 3 and injured 229. Libyan soldiers died in pointless military adventures, including failed interventions in Chad and Uganda, as Gaddafi attempted to spread his ideology across Africa. When the Arab Spring reached Libya in 2011, Gaddafi ordered security forces to fire on peaceful protesters and hired foreign mercenaries to crush the uprising, leading to a civil war that killed over 10,000 people. He surrounded himself with an all-female bodyguard unit called the Revolutionary Nuns, while allegedly maintaining a network of sexual abuse against women and girls. Gaddafi was captured by rebel forces in October 2011 near his hometown of Sirte and killed in graphic circumstances that were filmed and broadcast worldwide. Libya descended into ongoing civil war after his death, with rival governments, ISIS gaining a foothold, and the country becoming a major route for migrants attempting to reach Europe. Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad inherited Syria's dictatorship from his father Hafez in 2000 and has presided over a civil war since 2011 that has killed over 500,000 people and displaced 13 million, roughly half of Syria's pre-war population. When peaceful protests erupted during the Arab Spring, Assad's security forces fired on demonstrators, sparking a conflict that evolved into one of the 21st century's worst humanitarian catastrophes. His regime has repeatedly used chemical weapons against civilians in violation of international law, including the Ghouta attack in August 2013 that killed approximately 1,400 people with sarin gas. The Caesar photographs smuggled out of Syria by a military photographer in 2014 documented the torture and deaths of at least 11,000 detainees in government custody through systematic starvation, beating, and execution. Assad's forces have deliberately targeted hospitals, schools, and residential areas with barrel bombs, unguided explosives dropped from helicopters that cause indiscriminate destruction. The siege of eastern Ghouta saw government forces use starvation as a weapon of war, blocking food and medical supplies to rebel-held areas for years. Sednaya prison has become notorious for mass executions, with reports suggesting thousands have been hanged in secret trials, and survivors describe systematic torture designed to break prisoners physically and psychologically. With support from Russian airstrikes and Iranian ground forces, Assad has regained control of most Syrian territory, but the country lies in ruins. The war created the worst refugee crisis since World War II, with millions fleeing to neighboring countries in Europe and entire cities like Aleppo and Homs reduced to rubble. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi led the Islamic State from 2010 until 2019, declaring himself caliph in 2014 and establishing a so-called caliphate that at its peak controlled territory the size of Great Britain across Iraq and Syria. ISIS enforced a brutal interpretation of Sharia law that included public executions by beheading, burning alive, drowning in cages, and throwing people from buildings, with videos of these killings distributed as propaganda to terrorize enemies and recruit followers. The genocide of Yazidis in northern Iraq saw thousands of men and boys executed while women and girls were enslaved as sexual property, with mass graves still being discovered and excavated. ISIS recruited child soldiers known as the Cubs of the Caliphate, indoctrinating children as young as 8 to fight and execute prisoners, creating a generation traumatized by violence. When ISIS occupied Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, from 2014 to 2017, mass graves containing over 10,000 bodies were discovered after liberation, revealing the scale of executions carried out against perceived enemies. The group conducted executions in Palmyra's ancient Roman amphitheater and destroyed priceless archaeological sites, claiming they were idolatrous. Estimates suggest between 33,000 and 100,000 ISIS fighters were killed during the war to defeat the physical caliphate, with thousands of civilians dying in coalition airstrikes and urban combat. ISIS inspired or directed terrorist attacks worldwide, including Paris, Brussels, Manchester, and dozens of other cities, spreading violence far beyond its territory. Baghdadi was killed during a U.S. Special Forces raid in northwestern Syria in October 2019, detonating a suicide vest as troops closed in, but ISIS ideology continues to inspire extremists globally despite the loss of territory. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.